News, which is the environmental news platform of the Global Landscapes Forum. In the past couple of weeks, 3 major new reports on the state of the world's biodiversity have been released. They were put together by the world's top scientists, experts, and indigenous and local communities. And the findings were quite stark. We've lost 68% of the world's animal population since 1970, and none of the 20 global goals for biodiversity, known as the HE targets, were reached upon their deadline this year. But the reports were not entirely hopeless. They also put forth some actions that we can take as a global community to prevent further loss and extinction. So today we're going to hear from 3 leaders of these reports. We have with us Rebecca Shaw, coming to us from California and the World Wildlife Fund, which released its flagship Living Planet report on September 10th. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us so early in the morning. From Copenhagen, we have Tim Hirsch, who leads the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which was instrumental in sourcing data to the UN's 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook, which was released September 15th. And we have Joji Carino from the Ibaloi Igorot Indigenous Group in the Philippines, and she comes from the Forest Peoples Program, which led the local Biodiversity Outlook report, which examines the role of indigenous and local communities who care for 1/4 of all the lands in the world. So very instrumental for biodiversity. And thank you for joining us so late. So we can just dig in here. How close are we to a collapse of biodiversity and another mass extinction? What findings have surprised you all? Perhaps, Rebecca, we can start with you.
Yeah, I do think that, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and it's great to be here with the other distinguished guests. It is not surprising that we continue to decline in populations around the globe. Of course, populations represent the status of ecosystems around the globe, and the fact that it's declining and we're not meeting the Aichi targets go hand in hand. We really, the biodiversity, looking at populations, it really is the canary in the coal mine and a wake-up call for all of us. 2020 is a year where a number of policy agreements are going to be made. It's critically important that the Aichi targets are the post-2020 Aichi targets are embraced. They're very, very aggressive, and that they take into account the state of where we are and the fact that we're dependent on nature. So it's really alarming.
Mm-hmm. Joji, what surprised you from the findings of these reports?
Yeah, I follow biodiversity reports and trends quite closely. But still, when the reports came out, I really was quite alarmed at the extent of biodiversity loss, and also how centrally our economic, political, and cultural systems are implicated in the destruction of nature. There is convergence in the findings, but I think they could be a little bit more joined up in thinking, particularly on the ways forward. Most recommendations for me are still very focused at the top level decision making to drive solutions, whereas the power of community and citizens' actions are sometimes underreported. So LBO2 highlights the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities. And I think here we can also find solutions and signs of hope. And it's good that these global reports should be working together.
Mm-hmm. And Pam, over to you. What's your reaction been to these reports?
Well, unfortunately, as with the other speakers, in a sense, none of us can be very surprised at the overall outcome, because those of us who have been following these trends over the past few years will have known by now that unfortunately things are not yet on the turn. They're not yet moving in the right direction. And as well as those indicators and those targets that are measuring the current state of biodiversity, such as, for example, species populations, and indeed the current trends in terms of threats of extinction. The thing which is most concerning in a way is that the pressures behind them are also going in the wrong direction. So although, of course, it's expected that if policies were moving in the right direction, that the planet is not going to respond immediately. But you first at least need those pressures to start to be genuinely addressed. So, for example, the big pressures such as changes of land use and the conversion of habitats, pressures such as climate change itself, pollution, overexploitation, invasive alien species. Those are the kind of the big 5 categories of pressures, and those are still intensifying. And it's really until we see some sort of turn in those direct pressures, then we can't expect to see that those downward trends start to reverse. On the other hand, and I think Joji started to point to some of the where we can see the solutions in progress. And it's not that this was a surprise, but I think it is important to really pay attention to some of the positive trends and the effective action that has been taking place at many levels, which unfortunately it's easy for that to be eclipsed and that to be, because it is overbalanced in the end by the overall trends. But some areas of progress, such as we have seen a significant increase in the area of both land and oceans put under protected areas. We have seen significant progress in well-regulated fisheries, for example, where you can see where there is good management of fisheries, good measurement, scientific measurements of stocks. You are starting to see fish stocks recovering in significant parts of the world. And even on the question of extinctions, there has been recent research included in the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which demonstrates that conservation action has been effective in preventing a significant number of extinctions, and you can actually pinpoint individual species that, were it not for very intensive conservation action in those cases, would very probably be extinct by now. So in amongst that, yes, very alarming overall picture, it's important to demonstrate that where good action is taken, where positive policies are put in place, you can see positive results. It's just that we obviously need much more of that to see a reversal of current trends.
Mm-hmm. And as you're saying, political action is so important for conservation of biodiversity, and we can see such positive results when policies are put into place around protected areas, fisheries law, etc. Rebecca, what sort of reception have you seen among politicians and decision makers to the Living Planet report and to other biodiversity suggestions put forth in the past couple weeks?
Well, decision makers and policymakers, I don't know, have not yet responded, but certainly there was, I think, along with all these reports, quite a bit of media interest in the findings of the reports, and certainly the interest in the fact that we continue to see declines, and even more stark declines than we had seen before. And so I think the reason having these reports come out the week of the UN General Assembly, where the nations were gathered to talk about the state of the environment, critically important, is a red flag that say you need to pay attention to this. We'll see after this week how much they pay attention to it, and we'll certainly see, this certainly gives some guidance to us all in working with the UN and with governments to better make this a priority, make biodiversity in their backyards and around the globe. And also to understand how you make the connection between what this loss means for you and your people, and how you actually ground it in real actions on the ground, in real policies in effect our communities across the globe. So Joji had a very important point. A lot of this gets implemented at the local level, and it's really important to support the local level in making the changes we need to reverse the loss of biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. And we'll definitely get back to the local level in a bit, but I just wanted to kind of bounce off what you said at the beginning there about media. Tim, you come from a background in journalism and worked for the BBC reporting for quite some years. What is it like to be on the flip side of that equation now? How are you seeing the media address and cover biodiversity and put that information forth to the public?
Well, it's a little while since I crossed to the other side, as it were. My journalism days finished in 2006, but I think that certainly in terms of the coverage of this, the latest reports, the level of interest in the media in biodiversity issues, I would say, has gone up significantly over the years. And I think particularly there are various components and reasons for that coming together now, perhaps because of the intensity of the warnings that are coming out from the scientific assessments. There is also, and I think this is a common issue in terms of the way that this issue is covered in the media, is that there is often a comparison made, for example, with the level and the sort of size of attention given to the climate change issue and the biodiversity issue. And it certainly has been the case, and certainly was the case when I was an environmental reporter, that relatively speaking, biodiversity as an issue has been given much less attention than climate change. But I think one of the things you are starting to see now, particularly with some of the ground up, the bottom up movements you're seeing around the world, is that people are realizing that these things are very closely connected. I mean, the science has been telling us that for a very long time. But I think when you see the alarm and the public concern that's raised about climate change, there's very often significant components of concern much more broadly about what we're doing to the living planet, to nature, that it's combined with those concerns. And I do think, and I'll speak as an ex-journalist, that what does sometimes tend to happen is that this whole global issue, including biodiversity, often ends up sort of coming under the umbrella of climate change. So it's almost like the two things are seen as interchangeable. And of course, it is true that climate change itself is a huge pressure on biodiversity, so that it's linked in that way. But it's also linked in terms of the solutions, that by adopting what's sometimes described as nature-based solutions, using the importance of protecting nature as a means of both slowing climate change and also increasing resilience and increasing the ability to adapt to climate change, there are big opportunities. And I think we're starting to see that in bringing these two big issues much closer together and seen as part of an integrated whole in terms of our collective concern about the planet.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, they're so integrated and they have to be addressed together. So I want to skip forward a bit to the Aichi targets, and there were 20 of them put together, these global goals for biodiversity a decade ago, and their deadline was this year. And the Global Biodiversity Outlook found that none of them have been fulfilled in full. Some of them have been partially completed. Some have been hardly touched. And we're on the cusp of developing a new strategy for post-2020 and leading up to 2050 for biodiversity. So I would like to hear from you what you would like to see in this new strategy, taking into account everything that's come in the past decade, and how do you balance realism with ambition in a new set of targets? So let's maybe start with you, Joji.
I think all of these reports are really focusing on where biodiversity where actions need to be targeted, right? It's very sad that Target 18 on traditional knowledge and customary use was really undervalued in the current strategy. And so also from the evidence coming, for example, from the IPBES report, the fact that biodiversity is still in a good state or in a better state on indigenous lands is already pointing to the need to give much greater attention to that. So in the coming targets, we would like to see indigenous lands as a distinct category of protection, right, under, say, Target 1 on spatial planning. And that needs to be reflected in Target 2 on the how much expansion should happen. It is clear that a lot of this will need to work with communities. And unless our rights are also respected, then there is actually a very big risk that there will continue to be land grabbing and human rights violations. So that's a very central issue we're looking at. Also Target 19 currently on the partnerships between science and indigenous and local knowledge. I think that's very, very important because we really need to have a holistic and reciprocal approach in terms of knowledge building. And of course, the support for indigenous peoples, youth, and women as central to a whole society approach, and really galvanizing the energy from the grassroots will be important, because in the past decade, this became quite a narrow activity of ministries, and that really needs to be addressed in the coming decade.
So a more central role of people, absolutely. Rebecca, let's hear from you. And this time, it was a bit tricky to hear you last time, so maybe if you could speak a little closer to the microphone, it might help a bit.
Apologize for that.
No worries at all.
I think it is it's a really interesting time, because we are seeing in real time how connected climate change and biodiversity loss are, and what the kind of catastrophic events that are unleashed when we don't take care and don't steward the climate and don't steward nature well. The fires we've seen in Australia and in California are an example of that. Certainly the increased frequency of storms and how much damage there is in coastal areas is more due to the loss of nature in those coastal areas than it is due to the intensity of the storm due to climate change. But we can see climate change signals and the degradation of nature signal in every single one of these catastrophic events that we're seeing across the globe. And ultimately, the impact is on local people everywhere. And so it is really important that we understand we better make the connection in these global agreements to the outcomes at the community level, and make sure that communities can be a part of how we understand the science at the global level, the impacts at the local level, and begin to connect these up in very systematic solutions. It's no longer adequate to have solutions at the global level only, because we're seeing the impacts are remarkable, and they're at levels we never thought we would ever see, and that nature, and it's because nature and climate are so closely connected. Fortunately, as others have said, the solution to climate, the solution to the biodiversity loss, many of those solutions are interacting as well, and also interact with with decreasing the number of spillover events in diseases like COVID-19. And so we're getting alarm bells across the planet that we need to take care of nature, we need to steward our climate, and otherwise these events will continue to have global and local impacts.
Absolutely. And you mentioned natural disasters and the increasing frequency and intensity of them. And Joji, you live in a part of the world in the Philippines that often gets hit by hurricanes and typhoons, and the coral reefs are suffering. How are you seeing the intensity of natural disasters affect biodiversity in your region, also abroad in the world?
Yes, the Philippines has been experiencing really more frequent and very strong typhoons. But for example, the one that affected the central part of the Philippines, the islands, it was shown that the areas where mangroves were being recovered and restored, those were areas where less impact of those very, very strong typhoons where many died. Also, for example, in Australia, millions of animals, unfortunately, and died during the most recent fires. But now there's a greater appreciation of fire management that have been done by the Aborigines. And this is now being brought in systematically in planning on how to do better control of fires. And also, for example, the locust swarms in Africa, very much local communities are doing the sightings and are helping the government and to control and work with controlling those swarms. So whilst the impacts are really very strong, we should also understand how communities are trying to work to be able to address those kinds of natural disasters. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And going to the second part of it of what Rebecca said, addressing COVID and the rise of emerging infectious diseases, and that has been so directly linked to biodiversity loss and land use change and deforestation. Tim, how are you seeing this pandemic raise awareness and build momentum for the conservation of biodiversity, or are you at all?
Well, I think it's really difficult when we're still right in the middle of that storm, as it were, in the middle of the crisis, to really evaluate what kind of overall impact even it's having now, let alone how it might change things in the future. And on the one hand, I think unquestionably, as Rebecca's pointed out, I mean and Joji, the clear or the very strong evidence of linkage between the emergence of pandemics and the way that people are treating the natural environment is becoming ever clearer, and people are, in that sense, I think, are during this crisis, in many cases, making that link between what happens to nature and our own lives in a shocking and very stark way. There has also been, in some sense, a realization, once you start to see a slowdown and a lockdown of human activity. In some cases, there has been more awareness of the nature around us. I think the importance of space, in particular green space within cities, has never been shown as being more important, when it's so fundamental to the physical and mental health of people as they are in this crisis situation. And in some senses, and it's you don't want to talk about positive impacts when we're living through such a global tragedy, but there are possibilities that in the process of reconstruction, of rebuilding economies, there is an opportunity to bring about some of the transformative changes that all of our reports are showing is essential. If this opportunity is taken to take account of what needs to be done in terms of better respect for nature, in the way that investment is made, and this phrase "build back better." On the other hand, and this is where I think it's impossible to say, which of these trends will win out, there are inevitably going to be great pressures as governments and all parts of society see solving the economic crisis as being the absolute #1 priority. There is also going to be a temptation, in some ways, maybe to move backwards and start to loosen some of the environmental safeguards and regulations that exist in order to be able to create jobs and to increase people's prosperity. So I think there are risks. Also, the way that the reluctance, for example, that many people are having now to use public transport could push people back into more private car use, and you could see some reversal of trends. So I think, as I say, right in the middle of things, it's very difficult to see what sort of long-term trend will arise from this. But definitely there are both opportunities and long-term risks, I would say, from the current situation.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca or Joji, would either of you also like to comment about how you hope to see the learnings and lessons from this pandemic translate into biodiversity conservation?
Yes, and I'd like to highlight that in fact, community solidarity has strengthened in terms of people really coming together and seeing that a lot of the support for addressing the current problems in health, in food, in policy, in talking about policy, there's a lot of community building that's also been happening. So that's something that we hope will just build up into addressing this big emergency that we're all facing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just say, to follow on Joji, is that the emergency has given more people a time to reflect, both policymakers and people at local areas. And I just want to check, can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's much better.
Yeah, great. We are seeing more and more focus on bringing different knowledges together, on linking and having an integrated sense of nature and climate as an integrated set of goals for us to go after. And so you'll see in the upcoming UN Convention on Climate Change, the talk will be very much around nature-based solutions to climate change, but also the nature-based solutions that embrace the restoration of nature, the protection of nature, and the restoration of nature for the benefit of the climate. And then the connection of that kind of activity to the biodiversity protection as well. And so you're seeing the links and the conversations about nature, about climate, and about the COVID-19 come together in platform after platform after platform, where there are discussions happening, and then a better understanding that both the science and traditional knowledge is critical for implementing all of them. And so it'll be really interesting to see what happens in 2021 with the development of the post-Aichi targets, and what happens at the UNFCCC meeting in Glasgow next year, because there is this focus, and we'll see how this focus manifests. But I see that there is interest across different private sectors, across communities around the globe, and certainly within the conservation community, to move these things, to make sure that we have an integrated view of how these things connect so that we can implement in that way as well. It's critically important for the next steps. There's a lot of conversation, of course, about transformative change. Transformative change comes with thinking about these issues very differently. And I see people more than I ever seen in the past, and policymakers and colleagues, seeing these issues very differently than they had before.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you guys so much. We're going to leave some time now for questions from the audience. We have a few minutes left and some questions are coming in. So we have a question from Abel Ayniman from Peru. And Abel is asking about how biodiversity in the global south and the loss of it in the Amazon and other global south regions is linked to global consumption in the north. So how should responsibility be differentiated between consumers in different regions of the world in relation to biodiversity loss and behavior change? I can put that to Rebecca. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to just say that when I think about and when I say these issues are becoming integrated like they never had been before, there has been a focus on deforestation being driven by production and consumption practices that are unsustainable. The production practices certainly in the way when we deforest in order to grow more food for the planet, but then we feed that food that we're growing to animals and the inefficiencies that's involved there, really problematic. But it's all driven by consumption, and it's really important that we understand the links between production and consumption, particularly of food, and particularly of the consumption in the north. The waste having to do with the consumption of food in the north, and our dietary choices that are not only unhealthy for us, but they're unhealthy for the planet. So this is a conversation that's ongoing. There are efforts to make sure that production and consumption targets are very clear in delivering on the post-Aichi targets, and we'll see where that goes. But where does the policy making happen for really focusing on consumption? That's an important thing for us to be discussing, and an important thing for us to be connecting both to the climate agenda and the biodiversity agenda and the health agenda.
Mm-hmm. Joji or Tim, would you like to comment as well on this policy making around consumption? I think this is a really important issue.
Yes, I'd like to build on what Rebecca was saying, because in fact, our food chains, the global food chains, which is really driven by industrial agriculture, and it's clearly one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. It has also been one of the drivers of the destruction of local production systems, which are more biodiverse and more nutritionally rich. So I think one of the areas that we really need to address is having more diverse local economies, and also changing our very long chains of industrial production in agriculture, which are actually one of the biggest problems we have in biodiversity loss. I think that's very clear in all of the reports that have been coming out.
Mm-hmm. So really bringing food systems back more to a local level. And what about you, Tim? What have you seen, and what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I think what is very clear in all of the reports that are coming out is the way that there are very, very close connections over long distances, both in terms of the causes and the impacts of what we're doing to nature and the planet. And I mean, a lot of it has been pointed out already in terms of consumption clearly having impacts across the world in terms of the pressures it then puts on distant ecosystems and the need to convert more habitats. And of course, the impacts of that, yes, they have a huge impact locally when there is loss of biodiversity, but as we know, there is then a global impact on from loss of biodiversity in very distant parts of the world. So-called telecoupling is the way it's often phrased. And I think just maybe one thing to point out is that within the Global Biodiversity Outlook, there is a summary of some of the main areas of transition that are required if we're going to bring about this kind of change. And a very important part of this is around urbanization and urban areas. Given that we already have a majority of the world's population living in cities, and that proportion is going to be steadily increasing over the next few years. So what happens in cities is critically important to the whole planet. And that also is not just about what happens in the cities themselves, but then the footprint of those cities across different parts of the world. So when you talk about green urbanization or sustainable urbanization, yes, part of that is what happens within cities to allow more green spaces and to allow for better quality of life. But it's critically also what the impact of those food choices and consumption choices of urban populations are, and realizing the impact that then has on distant ecosystems. So I think the issue of global responsibility, both in terms of causes and impacts, is critically important for the way we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Switching gears a bit, we have a question for you, Joji, coming from, I don't have a name for this question, but one of the findings of the reports was about the increase in protected areas and protected waters as well. What is the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in co-managing these protected areas going forward?
First, we have to say that a lot of management of nature has continuously been happening in communities over a long period, right? So in countries where governments have put in place policies to support land rights of indigenous peoples, co-management has been able to happen. It's starting to happen here in the Philippines. It's happening in Australia. But not all governments have that enabling policy framework or legal framework in place. So that needs to be put in place in order for better collaboration between conservation on the ground together with the governments, right? So there is also the distinct governance systems of indigenous peoples, which have actually been producing very good conservation outcomes. So we should look at a range of ways of conservation. Governments, for example, de jure should support indigenous to make it legal, because de facto there has been a lot of conservation already happening. But we need a real good enabling policy environment for co-management or collaboration to happen between indigenous peoples and all the other actors who are also active in the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and hopefully that will be a bigger part of the next strategy and set of goals. So I know that we're almost out of time here, and we have a question that's kind of popping up in different words and ways among the audience, but it's basically about the gap between policymakers and the general public, and what should average citizens be doing to be advocating for better biodiversity policy or putting pressure on governments to really take stronger stances on conservation efforts? What can people do to help? We can start with you, Kim.
Right, thanks. Well, I mean, at least some of the issues and conclusions contained in our reports do demonstrate that individual choices, particularly, for example, on diets and the sourcing of food waste, can have an enormous impact and are critically important in terms of reversing the current trends. So I think choices more questioning about the sourcing of food and dietary choices is one area where people can certainly make a difference. I think also just taking an interest in nature, trying to remove some of the barriers that have emerged between a large part of the population, and realizing that nature is not something separate from ourselves, but is we're part of nature, whether we live in urban environments or not. I think breaking those down, including through education for getting out. I mean, in my area, the area of my organization, which deals with environmental data, I think the sort of revolution in platforms dealing with citizen science, for example, can and has made a great difference in getting people really not just interested in a sort of casual way in just receiving information about nature, but actually seeing citizens as contributing to the evidence base, which then helps all of us to come to sensible and logical solutions for dealing with biodiversity. So I think just getting out there and looking at what's around you, what's in the microbiome in your own back garden, can be a great way just to get people to remove some of that that distance which is built up between many societies and the natural world.
Mm-hmm. I think that message of refostering this connection with nature and that we're a part of it is really powerful, and it is popping up more in the public discourse, and that's exciting to see. Rebecca, what do you think that everyone can do to help?
Well, again, I think one of the exciting things we're seeing is more awareness about the connection of these issues. And I agree that food, it seems so not connected to the issues we're talking about, but it is exactly the issue we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Food has such a large impact on biodiversity, the way we produce and consume food, and we are making ourselves unhealthy at the same time. So food, eat good food, eat local food, decrease the amount of animal protein, and make sure that you don't waste food, and look into make sure that you are taking care of yourself and taking care of nature when you choose what to eat and how to eat it. Super important. And then, of course, letting your voice be heard through whatever channel you have. Vote. Make sure that you're writing about these issues. Make sure you're educating yourself about the connection between biodiversity loss, between climate degradation, and the rise of zoonotic diseases. Educate yourself and make your voice be heard. It's really critical at this time. It's a turning point. We do have more people than ever before talking about biodiversity and the connections, and we need to really activate our voices on these issues now. It's a critical time, and we may have time in the future, but the loss and the damage, if we wait any longer, will be so great. So look at what you eat, make your voice be heard in any way you can, and make sure that you are active.
Thank you for those powerful words. And especially in the US right now with elections coming up, I think it's a critical time for everyone to be speaking out in any way they can and to vote. And to you, Joji, what are your last words and your messages to everyone who's listening?
This was supposed to be the super year on biodiversity, in that we were going to have these big meetings. But because they haven't taken place, in fact, it's still a big year for biodiversity in terms of consciousness. I think the awareness and understanding of these issues, also because of the impact of COVID-19, is really making people more reflective and considering exactly our lifestyles, and also giving more time to education, just talking with each other. So I hope that this change in understanding and what we're doing, for example, in disseminating local biodiversity outlooks, that's also our effort in spreading the word.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to all of you speakers. This was such an informative and wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time coming in from across the world, and I can see that our audience has also learned a lot and appreciated it as well. So thank you once again, and for all of your work putting forth these really important reports. And for anyone who's listening who would like to learn more, there's a Global Landscapes 2-day forum about biodiversity at the end of October, the 28th, 29th. And also the next GLF Live will happen next Friday. It's about the wildfires happening in the Amazon and in California. We'll hear from a couple of fire experts, so that should be very interesting as well. So thank you all for joining us. Enjoy your weekends and watch what you eat. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.